Today's story begins in one of the principalities, where the king has already received all the documents regarding the capitulation of the Principality of Shadate. The area beyond the Halric iron mine was a long-held dream that no one had ever been able to achieve. The man thanked his assistant for the documents he received, as he had done quite a difficult job. The king was extremely pleased to think about what reward could be given to this man upon completion of the task, after which he asked him whether his son had reached marriageable age during the ongoing war. The royal family was obliged to take full responsibility for him, which is why the man was interested in the boy's age. The son of one of the main assistants had recently turned 24, which meant he was ready. The king, looking at the young man who stood before him, said that this was the most ideal age for him. At this point, the king announced that he absolutely wanted to marry his sister to this particular man. The girl was a princess hidden from everyone, which is why no one ever really saw her. The assistant could not understand why the king was wooing a girl whom most people believed to be already dead. But he continued to talk about how all the border residents would finally be able to see their princess for the first time. The princess of the kingdom of Escalir was the sister of the king, who treasured the girl very much. At that moment, a girl named Miesa came out to everyone present. She was the princess of this kingdom. The brother began to say that this girl was very shy, after which he asked her to come closer to him. As soon as the lady began to walk, her steps became more and more uncertain, after which she simply fell down in front of the king. Because of the situation that had occurred, the man asked for understanding, since his sister was ill, which is why she could not walk normally. The assistant began to say that it was an honor for all of them at that moment to greet the princess, even though she was ill. The son said that he would be ready to try his best to do everything possible not to disgrace the princess and her brother. He also began to say that the guy should take a closer look at the one who would soon become his wife as soon as possible, after which the guy walked up to her and sat on one knee, looking closely at the girl, who did not understand what was happening. Suddenly, he took the girl's hand and, bowing before her, said that it was a great honor for him to serve the princess. However, Misa abruptly pulled her hand back and began to look at the man in horror, which greatly increased the tension in the situation. Her brother told her that she shouldn't have behaved like that in front of her future husband, after which he began to talk about how she needed to apologize to the guy, since the lady had done a bad thing. For a long time, a fierce war raged in the kingdom, the heroes of which undoubtedly were the Cladness. However, the king did not like this at all, which is why he decided to invent this whole marriage. But the assistant was not at all happy that for his help, he received only some underdeveloped girl as a reward. His son understood perfectly well that they could not possibly refuse the decision made by the king. Although this wedding was completely unwanted, no one had a choice, which made it inevitable. Since the boy was the young Lord Cladni, he was obliged to fulfill his duties. But when Eric's cousin found out about all this, he began to think about what would happen now with the engagement to the Crispin family. As much as one would like to do this, it would have to be cancelled, since it was unknown how the king would act after the refusal. After which, the count turned to his wife, asking her if she was angry about the situation that had happened. After a couple of minutes, it finally dawned on Madame that they had been talking to her all this time, and she simply asked again about what had been said. Before this, she had discussed with the maids where the future princess should sleep, and in which room. The lady stood her ground and said that the girl would have to live in a room connected by a passage, but the maids were against it. Since the princess was not well, she had to live with someone, because if something happened to her, the emperor would be furious. And when Madame spoke about the servants, the ladies could not believe that a woman could so easily entrust the king's daughter to some servants. But then she became furious because everything was converging on the fact that it was her son who would have to look after this girl. The night of that day was completely and utterly filled with nothing but bitterness and resentment for everyone. But Eric was completely calm. After some time, the day came that no one wanted so much, but could not do anything about it. And the news that the wedding between the heir and heiress would take place brought smiles to the faces of tired people. It was natural that everyone was excited, but no one even suspected the truth. People wondered what the princess looked like. Everyone was interested in what kind of lady she became after she grew up. But then all the fuss was stopped by the news that the Count Margrave himself had arrived to see them, arriving with his wife. But he was informed that the emperor would not be able to personally attend his sister's wedding. Having learned all this news, the lord could not believe that the man intended to mock him completely. But no one was going to interrupt the ceremony, which is why all the spectators took their places to participate in it. The priest asked the groom to take his place on the pedestal and wait for the ceremony to begin. At that moment, the princess appeared from behind the door, led by two women, since she was unable to walk normally. People whispered about whether the girl was drunk, but after that, they came to the conclusion that the lady was ill. The groom waited for the moment when the priest had finished saying all his words to complete the entire wedding ceremony. The priest said that now the boy and girl could kiss each other because they were now married. That night, Eric was told that he should not harm his wife, but in any case, confirmation of the consummation of the marriage was required. After some advice from the maids, the man went to his new wife's room. When he walked inside, he saw a girl tied to a bed, who was barely moving and just staring at one point. Suddenly, the man turned to his new wife, trying not to frighten her, and to return the situation to a calm state for both of them. But then, he saw vials of sedatives, but such a quantity could have put a horse to sleep. Eric could not understand why so much sedative was used on a person who was on the verge of fainting. It was too cruel to do this even to prisoners of enemy countries, and here the girl was in such a deplorable state. It was obvious that no one would have done this without the king's order, which only meant that it was his doing. Eric also noticed that he was cold lying in that position, so he decided to help her free herself, after which he asked her if she was okay and if she needed anything. However, even if she had nodded, her husband would not have been able to believe that a woman in such a situation could be normal. It could have been too much for her, since her wrists were still tied and she couldn't move them properly. After Eric freed her, he noticed that his wife had dark fingertips, which was a problem. However, they had no other choice, and he would have to do everything himself to improve his wife's condition. Without thinking twice, Eric warned his wife that he would be crawling under the covers for a short while, but she didn't have to worry about that. After some time, both he and his wife were lying down and talking to each other. Eric introduced himself to her and told her who he was. He also had to explain what had happened today and where they were now. However, he could not know for sure how much the girl understood of what was said and how comfortable she felt now. Suddenly, he noticed her fingertips again, and then remembered that frostbite starts there. It was very important at such moments to get the blood circulating throughout the body so that bad situations would not happen. But at that moment, Eric noticed that the woman had already fallen asleep, which is why he stopped talking. There was speculation that she was feeling much better, as her face had returned to its normal color. Now, however, all he needed to do was create proof that the wedding night had been a success. In the morning, the man was met by the maids and asked how long ago he had woken up. Eric didn't answer most of these questions and simply handed them the bloody sheet. The maids simply said that they were going to give the sheet to the priest, after which one of them went to the princess's room to visit her and help her. Eric began to stop the woman, saying that his wife had not yet woken up and that he needed to visit her later. After this statement, the women agreed to come later to give Messiah some more rest. At this time, the man went inside and saw that his wife had attacked something and was biting it. He immediately began to stop her and tell her that this thing was completely inedible. He immediately realized that the woman was clearly hungry, so he began to look around the room in search of food. Suddenly, he saw croissants, which is why he decided to offer one of them to her, which surprised the lady a little. However, I didn't think for long and simply took it and began to eat it, enjoying the taste of the pastry. At that moment, Eric was glad that he was able to please his wife and help her with her hunger at least a little. Later in the evening, the man brought his wife and introduced her to his parents. Realizing that they were not particularly happy, Eric's father could not understand why his help to the king ended the way it did. Suddenly, he said that he was very tired and that the heir should go home and also rest. At this point, the lady climbed onto the bear statue, which greatly frightened most of the people present. When Eric picked up the lady, the maids started telling him to give the girl to them and go and rest. However, the man told them that they were all tired after the trip, but despite this, it was necessary to unpack the things that were on the maids. As soon as they left, Eric turned to the butler, who was a little surprised, but remained ready to accept the request. The man asked him to start taking care of the princess, as she was now also a member of their family. After a while, he announced that he would take care of the lady during dinner, which gave the maids a rest. However, they were not prepared for this, as they knew very well that the princess caused a lot of problems, especially during meals. At this point, Eric asked them if there was any food that the lady didn't like, or that she simply couldn't stand. Even after their answer, the man still had to ask his wife whether she could eat this or that. When she received a small piece of food, she immediately began to go crazy and throw everything off the table, which is why her husband had to calm her down. At this time, the maids were quietly laughing, and Eric began to hold Misa so that she would not kick so hard. At this point, he also turned to the maids, telling them that the princess needed to tidy herself up. At this time, the boy's father began asking his wife through sign language whether they should have left the girl alive. However, when he asked this, the woman replied that if they killed her, they would die themselves anyway. In the kingdom of Escalier, there were 3 families, all of whom were called pillars. The Salakas family was responsible for all internal stability and comfort of the kingdom. During this time, the Crispin family was responsible for the internal security of the estate, and the Haladny family was responsible for external security and some of the kingdom's policies. Each of these families had a huge influence on the army and defense, while the king had 3 spouses. The first was the daughter of the Duke of Salakez, who gave birth to a prince who ultimately did not perform royal duties. Under the pretext of restoring power, the Salakez family was destroyed by the king's own hands. Not satisfied with this, the man began to oppress the 2 remaining families, which they did not like very much. This led to the decision to conclude a secret agreement on succession and planning an uprising at the end of the war. However, plans changed as the Haladny family achieved undeniable success in the war and gained the sympathy of the people. Because of this, the king could not simply ignore what had happened, which is why he also decided to change his actions. The man was now furious that the princess was behaving inappropriately, since she didn't even know how to eat properly. As it turned out, everything was fine with this child before, but the sight of dying people in the kingdom brought her to this state. The count immediately began shouting that his son should not even dare to feel sorry for this girl, because his situation was even worse. Marquise Crispin said that if they wanted an heir to their family, they could simply change everything. Because of the crazy girl he got, Eric's entire position was in danger and could easily collapse. The boy asked his father whether their friend Hegel had decided to take this step, and whether it was possible to turn everything back. After this question, the father was dissatisfied with his son. It seemed that the boy had simply gone crazy as well. The king's cousin, Duke Hagael, was the only living member of the royal family other than the princess. However, this man became crippled due to an accident, which meant he could no longer have children. Realizing that absolutely nothing in this kingdom was going according to plan, the duke became furious. The son began to understand perfectly well that his father was completely unable to control himself and his emotions. At this point, the conversation began with the mother. She asked her son what he thought about uniting the 2 families. Eric knew very well that this was impossible to do at the moment, since the king could clearly observe all of this. Without a clear successor to the throne, convincing the nobility could take a very long time, certainly more than a year. Moreover, due to the long time on the battlefield, the Marquise's political instincts had become very dull. In a situation that is perfectly understandable, even to the youngest representatives like Eric, his father simply wanted to kill the princess. At this point, the boy informed his mother that at this moment they all needed to assess the situation sensibly. The countess informed her son that he had acted as usual and that it was perfectly fine when the maids were on their side. However, even despite this situation, Madame asked Eric not to become attached to his wife in any way. Male sympathy is superficial. There was a very small chance that the guy didn't have it that way. Why not just show kindness? After some time, Eric returned to his room and wondered whether his mother might also have wanted to get rid of the princess. As he walked, screams began to be heard from Misa's room, causing the man to immediately head in that direction. It turned out that the maids could not calm the woman down, as she had a lot of energy after eating. Along the way, the maids talked about this evening and about the faces of people who clearly did not expect anything like this. At that moment, Eric walked into the room and told them that they had all worked hard today. Although he only heard a couple of words from the maids' conversation, even from them, he understood perfectly well how they had addressed Miesia before. Eric said that the ladies were free today, and he was going to put his wife to bed himself. When they left, the man noticed that his woman was in quite a good mood today. Without thinking twice, he sat down next to her and began to tell her that this place was their capital estate, where they would now live. The thought in his head was that it seemed to him that when he entered, their glances met, but now the lady showed no signs of interest. He also examined his wife and noticed that she had not changed her clothes, which made him wonder if she had other clothes. and the clothes that the girl was wearing at the moment were very similar to a prison uniform. When the husband and wife met eyes, Misa began to spit again, hitting Eric right in the face. This made the man surprised, and he also told the lady to never spit in people's faces again. He also told the lady to go to bed, and that he would just lie down with her after he finished his work. If the girl needed something, she could easily turn to him. After some time, Eric and Miesa were already sleeping peacefully, although this did not happen immediately. However, at one point, the woman woke up out of the blue and never fell asleep again. The next morning, Eric tried again to feed his wife, but he was having little success. He also noticed that the lady's usual condition was now worse than usual again. While the man was deep in thought, his wife again began to do something unexpected during the reception. As soon as Miesa dipped her hand into the soup, she immediately grabbed it and began to drag it along with the food into her mouth. After the princess arrived at the count's mansion, everything began to move at a simply frantic pace, and the internal atmosphere in the estate changed greatly after the wedding of the heir and the princess. When Eric returned to his main business, everyone kept shouting at him that they were just waiting for him. It seemed as if everyone had a few words and requests for the heir, as well as news. The man got down to his main job, training his army and explaining techniques. For some reason unknown to everyone, Count Chladni began to avoid all family dinners, citing the fact that he had simply lost his appetite. The lady also expressed her dissatisfaction, saying that her husband had forgotten how to control his emotions. Even the vassals of the entire family were in complete confusion and incomprehension about everything that was happening. However, no one dared to openly express their dissatisfaction with Eric. The man was the only one all this time who was completely calm, the only one who remained unshakable. He was also told that Miesa had been exploring the new surroundings in the morning and was now in the maid's room. As soon as he found out about this, the man immediately went there, where he saw a picture of girls surrounding his wife and enjoying her. They were all delighted with the beauty of the young lady. Her hair was simply beautiful, not only in structure, but also in color. But all the delight was interrupted by Eric. He began asking everyone about where the two maids were, who constantly helped his wife. It turned out that they had gone somewhere, which meant that everyone else had to look after the wife. As soon as he began to lift the woman, the maids began to talk about how they had to put their clothes on her to make her warmer and softer. Eric told everyone that now they were completely free. Now he could look after Misa himself. Soon he was already in their room, heading towards the soft bed so that the lady would not be harmed. But at that moment, Misa herself woke up, not expecting anyone to carry her, which is why she started kicking. Eric began to ask his wife to be patient just a little longer, because if he let her go now, she would hurt herself. The man noticed that his wife clearly didn't love him very much, which is why she mostly used him only as a means of transportation. As soon as he noticed a thread in the lady's hair, he immediately reached out to remove it, thereby frightening his wife. Eric immediately began to say that he in no way wanted to scare her, but instead, on the contrary, he wanted to help. However, the woman did not react to these words, which made the man think that she was very scared. That evening, he sat and thought about why the maids from the kingdom were constantly looking for a suitable opportunity to leave the princess. Besides the question of whether the ladies were up to something, Eric's head was also filled with the food supplies of the inhabitants. He understood that at the moment he had too many problems that needed to be dealt with urgently. Besides this, there was another very important problem related to the report for the gentleman. As a result of the assigned surveillance of the man, it was confirmed that the man had another meeting on the outskirts. Along with Mr. Chladni, there was another strange woman, who supposedly came from the tavern. Everything gradually began to come together, because Eric's father had previously started talking about marriage with the Crispin family. At that time, it was Eric who was the only one who had a lot of suspicions about the whole situation, which turned out to be true. Although this proposal was not bad, the heir could not get rid of his own anxiety. It was because of this that he began to secretly follow his father, after which he immediately learned about a new woman from the tavern, whom the man met very often. It was then that Eric first encountered his parents' misdeed, which left quite a bitter taste in his mouth. But being between life and death on the battlefield, he could not dare to raise this topic in front of everyone. Instead, the guy tried to find out if the woman had any hidden motives or backers, but he didn't find anything worthwhile. This is precisely why the heir simply did not raise this issue even after the end of the war. Since the man had brought that girl with him, Eric had no choice but to warn his mother about it through a letter. To this, the woman replied that she was already old, so it didn't matter who her husband was with. Eric understood that if the woman had the rights of an aristocrat, it would be easier to find out any information about her. There was no information about the woman, except for the former Captain Kolbanig, who sometimes came to see her. When Eric read the letter he received, he realized that he could not find any new information about his mistress. He also understood perfectly well that his mother's reaction was completely natural, since their relationship was definitely not a love relationship. At that very moment, Eric heard footsteps heading towards his room, which immediately brought him out of his train of thought. As it turned out, his wife woke up and was confidently heading towards him. At this point, the man began asking her why she didn't lie back down and whether she needed anything. However, at that moment, the woman simply came closer to him, also trying to climb onto his lap. After which, Eric decided to show his wife how he works, which aroused great interest in Misa. At this point, the lady began to examine the documents and tear off small pieces of paper. Eric began to think that because of his dissatisfaction with the king, he did not even think about how his future life and marriage would go. When a man first encountered chivalry as a child, it filled him with a sense of responsibility. However, reality quickly brought the guy to his senses and shattered his dream. That's why Eric didn't expect much from his wife, even if she really enjoyed tearing paper into pieces. To be more precise, after realizing his position and responsibility as the heir, he did not place any hopes on women. At one point, when Miesa reached for another piece of paper, Eric immediately stopped her. He picked up the document and said in a calm voice that this document had not yet been read. Even if the lady started pestering her husband, he still would not give her this document. But even despite this, the woman still tried to get this paper from her husband's hands. In the morning, the lady's assistant suggested that she put a large brazier in their greenhouse, since an important concert was coming up. Mother said that it would be good for them to prepare a small brazier in advance, since this year it was colder than usual. At that very moment, the princess came to the women and immediately fell to the floor in front of the table. Madame did not expect this, since the lady usually stayed with the maids. But today she came here. The assistant noticed that the mistress called the lady princess, as if she were a stranger to them. The woman didn't even pay attention to this, since to this day she didn't know how best to address her. At that moment, she decided to ask the maid about the best way to address the princess, since during the war, all etiquette had changed greatly. When the assistant started to say something, Madame went into her thoughts. Realizing that the maids weren't even trying to fit into the new team, the woman immediately learned that it would be much better to address the princess by name, no matter how strange it may be. Since Eric and Miesa were now one family, the woman should have simply listened to her assistant's advice. When the madam addressed the girl, she immediately got up from the floor and began to smile broadly at the woman. Immediately, everyone began to say that the princess clearly liked Madame, since she allowed her to call her by her first name. At this point, the assistant noticed that the maids were behaving rather arrogantly and often found fault with everything. There were rumors that Madame Diela spent the entire day lounging around doing nothing, but still bathed the princess regularly, while Madame Malika was never seen in the vicinity of the estate. The lady wondered why the woman and her friend were constantly lazy, and whether there was a reason for this. At this point, all they would have to do was play along to get to the truth, since nothing was known yet. Suddenly, Madame asked Adele to bring her some medicine for her headaches, as they had become more frequent lately. When Adele returned to the lady, she asked her if it was really the most common medicine. At this point, the assistant noticed that the woman had become completely dejected and clouded. She was going to simply leave the medicine she had brought on the table, but she continued to worry about her. Adele also saw a picture of Misa lying on a woman's lap, something no one had been allowed to do before. If the lady had been very ill, she could have simply called a doctor, but the woman refused. Instead, she asked to know how old Miesha was, after which she learned that she was about 20. The lady was also told that at an early age, the girl had to watch her relatives die. Adele began to understand that her mistress was clearly beginning to sympathize and worry about this child. In addition, the lady said that despite the injury, the girl remained in excellent shape. The baby's features, as well as the color of her eyes, were very beautiful, which definitely made her impossible to destroy. Adele didn't notice this at all, since the girl had a crow's nest on her head that covered her face. As soon as she saw Misa's face, she realized that the color of her eyes seemed very familiar. At this point, the lady told the girl that she needed to be tidied up, and first of all, her nails needed to be trimmed. At this time, Eric was informed that his wife had spent the whole morning with the lady, which was a little unexpected for him. As soon as he headed to his mother's room, from which he heard some incomprehensible sounds and words, the women held Misa down and tried to trim her nails, but it turned out to be much more difficult than it seemed. The lady told her assistant that she should cut her nails herself, because sudden touches frightened the princess. At that moment, Eric appeared in the room, unable to understand what was happening there. He saw the scissors in his mother's hands, and also how she held his wife's leg. After which, the woman told her son that she was simply trying to cut his wife's nails, as they would soon be in her way. At that moment, the man felt extremely awkward, as he thought that they had decided to harm Misa, rather than help her. But he also understood perfectly well that it was extremely unusual for his mother to take care of someone. Normally, she could only feel a little sympathy, but for her to cut someone's nails was unheard of. Madame was rational, even with her own son, and never did anything like that. However, now the woman looks at the girl with a tenderness that was very difficult to believe. This expression on Madame's face was unique to one person. Perhaps it was because the mother remembered her daughter. At this point, Eric told his mother that he was ready to cut his wife's nails himself. Many questions arose in my head about whether it would be possible to leave everything as is, or whether it would be better to be wary. However, the reason for Eric's growing concern lay in his mother's behavior when her daughter Rosie died. Everyone present noticed that the princess behaved very well, unlike how she had behaved before. However, at that very second, Miesa's face changed dramatically, and she suddenly became dissatisfied. At this point, Adele noticed this and began to think about how the situation could be improved. And then she decided to give the young girl some delicious cookies, which surprised Misa. Eric immediately asked Adele what she had just done, to which she calmly replied that she had done it. It turned out that previously, Misa calmed down as soon as she received a little sweet. At this time, Mother watched as Miesa carefully bit off small pieces of the sweet, without even crumbling them. Now the woman was happy to watch how this child ate well, because she was very thin. Some time ago, Eric taught her to chew any food thoroughly, without swallowing it just like that. However, the thought remained in her head about what exactly Madame had seen, since she was able to remember her late daughter. This could have been due to the color of the wife's eyes, because it was very similar to the color of Rosie's eyes. Even if it was a matter of eye color, it was still unclear why Mother did not treat Amberic the same way as Misha. At this point, the butler brought in a recently cooked chicken for tasting, which had been served a little late. Suddenly, Eric thought about the fact that when they dine alone, the lady behaves quite calmly and decently. But at that moment, when another dish was brought, the wife began to behave in a way that was extremely unusual for her. At this point, the man began to assume that it was the chicken that was causing the desire to remove it. He immediately took the dish and called the butler, asking him to remove it, as they would not eat it all. Once the threat was removed, Eric wondered if the girl had had a negative experience with birds. The next day, the maids again found the woman on the cold floor. She did not want to leave the room. That's why the women decided to lay rags on the floor, so that Miesha wouldn't feel too hard and cold. When the girl lay down on the rags, she began to mumble something, which surprised the maids. Some suggested that the young lady did not even realize it, but this behavior was an unusual tendency. One of the maids noticed that the maid was constantly next to the lady, which was extremely unusual. But then each remembered how her husband behaved around the woman, because this had never happened before. Here the ladies started talking about the fact that, on the contrary, it was good that the master and mistress had a good relationship with each other. But at one point, every girl became quiet, which seemed very strange to the new girl, which is why she asked what happened. At this point, one of the maids said that it would be better for the mistress if she started wearing more expensive clothes. As it turned out, the girl was not dressed in expensive clothes, only because she got them dirty very quickly. Suddenly, one of the maids had the idea to make the mistress a bib, if that was the whole problem. At this point, most of the ladies decided to give the lady such a gift, as it would suit her perfectly. Eric, meanwhile, was at his work at the time, also noticing that it was already past lunchtime. The thought occurred to him whether his wife had been eating well all this time, since even in the morning she looked weak. On the first morning, Misa looked very ill and spent the whole day in her room. Before dinner, the woman fell into a stream in the garden, after which she changed her clothes and ate. But now she had to go to the maids. When Eric found out this, he was shocked, as he never expected that the lady could just take a bath in the stream. He was also told that most likely it happened when the lady was with the mistress, The man thought that if his wife was with his mother, then all this was not as dangerous as it could have been. As it turned out, Miesha also didn't like being in the chapel, which wasn't surprising, since there was nothing for a lady to do there. It turned out that the girl at first calmly followed the madam, who called her into the chapel. However, already at the entrance, Misa began to become very worried, which is why she had to be left with the maids. Eric began to think that if there were sweets inside, she would most likely like it inside. That's why the man asked the butler to make sure there was always at least a little something sweet on the tables. Towards evening, he sat with his wife at the table and tried to feed her, which this time worked out very well. At the same time, he was thinking about how good it was that the lady had already fully recovered all her strength. Eric immediately noticed that his wife did not eat any vegetables, so he asked her to try them too. When he held out his fork, a piece of vegetable fell from it right onto the lady's clothes, which Misa immediately noticed. However, the guy was a little embarrassed to remove the fallen piece from his wife, as it was lying right on her chest. It took him a long time to figure out why he simply warned his wife about what he was going to do. As soon as the piece was in his hands, Misa immediately reached for it, which surprised Eric quite a bit. When the man said he would cut off a new piece, the lady continued to stand her ground and reach straight for the hand. As soon as she managed to eat this vegetable, she accidentally touched her husband's hand with her lips, which caused him to immediately pull his hand away. Because of this gesture, Misa immediately began to pull the cloth off the table, causing all the food to fly into the air. One of the maids was watching all of this and could not understand why the husband and wife were making so much noise. Suddenly, she walked inside and started to lead away the girl, who was covered in soup, also thinking about how her husband wasn't tired of spending every evening in such an atmosphere. When everyone was already asleep, the man could not sort out the mess in his head. He understood that even though Miesa was his wife, she was no different from a child, and he felt warmth towards her. Eric knew very well that the princess was definitely not someone he could consider romantically. The next morning, the man was informed that there was supposed to be a poetry evening the following Wednesday. Since it would have been crowded, Miesa could have simply been scared, but there was no choice, since presence was mandatory. Besides, all the people were like hyenas who would look for a piece of meat, which is why it was necessary to show that everything was fine. The poetry evening sounded grand, but in reality, it was simply a meeting where like-minded people gathered. This year, it was Dem Chladni's turn to hold this meeting, which could not be cancelled. More important than the preparations that were taking place was the fact that the Marchioness Crispin and her only daughter were also expected to attend this meeting. Immediately, Misia received an offer from her mother to visit the greenhouse and see how beautiful it was there. However, Oscar decided to ask her if she had fun today at all and how she felt. The man's mother laughed at this, because he said it as if he was asking his nanny. But since her son was here, she suggested that he also go to the greenhouse, and at the same time show it to his wife. Looking at Miyasu, he wanted to refuse, since he still had things to do, but the idea came to mind to run there for a couple of minutes. Soon, Eric and his wife were already in the greenhouse, where the lady was delighted with the spectacle. Eric and most of the maids understood that Misa looked like a small child or an animal. The lady walked around the greenhouse and looked at everything that was there, while the others continued to do their work. The man, all this time, was thinking that he was becoming calmer and calmer when he saw Misa happy. It also seemed to him that his tense heart was gradually beginning to relax and live normally. At that moment, the maids approached Miesia, who were glad to see the young lady in this place. They couldn't believe that she came to look at the almost finished greenhouse. The women also decided to ask her why she had not entered the workroom earlier. However, at that very second, Misa saw a bird in a cage, which caused her behavior to change dramatically. Old memories began to surface in the girl's head, and it began to seem to her that the bird began to talk to her. It seemed that the lady's mother had made a mistake, for which she had to be punished, because the mistakes were unforgivable. At that very moment, the bird in the cage began to chirp very loudly, which only made the situation worse. At that very second, Misa fell to the floor screaming. She began to cover herself in every possible way to somehow protect herself. When Eric heard this, he immediately rushed towards his wife to help her somehow. He began to carefully lift the girl, asking her if she was okay and helping her come to her senses. While Miesa was crying, Eric started asking the maids what had happened here. But at that moment, the guy's wife rushed towards him and began to hug him, which surprised him. At this point, all the maids began to suspect that the problem was precisely the birds. or rather, the reaction to them. Misa's oldest maid said that the girl was indeed very afraid of birds. She also began to talk about how the princess always had a very peculiar and difficult to understand character. At this point, Madame told the maid that she should have told everyone about this in advance. But after Adele started accusing her, the maid began to stand her ground and say that she continued to take care of Miesa. Since she was constantly with her mistress, the maid could not understand why she was scolded so much for one mistake. During this time, the girl continued to sit in her husband's arms, crying into his shoulder. Eric decided to simply take his wife away from the birds, but even then she could not calm down. The man told his wife that from now on, there would be no birds in the greenhouse, and all those released would be removed. But then she began to show her husband that she wanted to go into the garden, which surprised him, because there could be birds there. Eric began to realize that there was a possibility that Miesa had previously felt trapped within 4 walls. Besides, if you don't count that trip to the chapel, previously the lady spent all her time only inside the estate. The man and his wife decided to sit on the swing, also telling her not to be afraid of anything and to just relax. Besides, he was going to simply drive away all the birds that might fly to this place. At that very moment, a familiar guy came to the couple, who did not expect to see Eric and Misa there. He also noted that the man appeared to be very close to her. When the acquaintance came closer, Eric began to tell him to leave, which made the guy indignant. He immediately began to talk about the fact that there were many rumors circulating about the man and his wife, which were spreading very quickly. Since the boy's uncle was currying favor with other family members to make his son the heir, the rumors could not be taken lightly. It turned out that the rumor was connected with one of Eric's maids, whose name was Bina. She was hired very recently, and that's probably why she and one other person were telling tall tales. The second man also had brown hair and a fairly slender body. While telling this story, Eric kept thinking that this guy didn't want to be the heir. Since Eric was the only one he could trust during the war, the boy stood by the man's side for a long time. But at that moment, he decided to thank him, since he owed the guy something again, since he told him everything. At this point, the newcomer asked his friend about what else had been going on with him recently. He told Eric that everyone had heard about how the man himself cut his wife's nails, which was extremely unexpected. The guy said that it was extremely unusual to see someone he knew today, and he had a strange feeling. It seemed to him that such behavior towards his wife was too much, because she was not a small child. The guy also heard that his wife's feet barely touched the floor, and he constantly carried her in his arms. Eric began to say that the guy himself could clearly see how difficult it was for Miesha to walk. The acquaintance began to say that, based on practical considerations of a sense of responsibility, as well as the man's sympathy, this was entirely expected. However, even with all this in mind, he said he still couldn't fully understand why things had turned out this way. When the boy heard about the rumors, it seemed as if everyone had staged a brilliant show to deceive the king. Since there was no one else there, the man simply had no reason to go that far. The acquaintance could not believe that Eric seriously wanted to live with such a woman. In his opinion, it would be much more logical to get rid of her, and then no one would have any unnecessary difficulties. Eric almost married Lackey Crispin, but suddenly this misunderstanding fell on his head. But then the man said that while the woman was in their family, she brought benefits to it, and that is why this was of great importance. The king left the family alone for the time being, and that was the best choice for now. And for the girl herself, this was also a pretty good option, since they treated her well, even though she didn't really know the person she was with. If everything were done as the friend wanted, then the lady would soon become simply unhappy. But then the guy told Eric that everyone who could treated the princess like the plague. Sometime later, the poetry evening arrived, and the greenhouse was completely ready to receive guests. One after another, ladies arrived who were in close alliance with the Chladni family. Also, as expected, the mother and daughter of the Crispin family arrived for the evening. After everyone had taken their seats, Eric and Misa came in briefly to greet them and the other guests. However, at that moment, the couple was hit by dozens of glances that simply pierced them right through. But Eric, without thinking for long, informed everyone that since his wife was ill, they were forced to leave the celebration first. As soon as the man and woman left, a representative of the Crispin family followed them and asked the couple to wait. Aaron began asking the woman what the matter was and what she needed. When he learned that she wanted to talk, the man asked if this act was reckless. At this time, a woman was watching them and trying in every possible way to eavesdrop on their conversation. Suddenly, the woman simply told Eric that he should under no circumstances have children with this girl. After some time, the woman and her mother headed to their home, where they started talking. The mother asked her daughter if she had done everything as she was supposed to, and if she had conveyed the message to him correctly. She then started talking about how disgusting it was to watch the couple hugging each other. It was the woman's daughter who was definitely liked by men. She had a sweet face and a good tone. It was she who had to enter the Chladni family, because only in this way could they receive proper treatment. It could be said that Lakeen Crispin was raised mostly for inheritance, taught only the virtues of a mistress. In the evening, Eric continued to work on paperwork, realizing that he had been overloading himself lately. His father, who became infatuated with his mistress, began to neglect family matters, which is why his son is having a blast. In the context of a long war, which resulted in significant human and property losses, the legacy remains. There was a food shortage this summer. If the soldiers could hold out at this moment, they would soon be able to return home. Considering the Chladni family played a huge role in the recent war, they deserved to be rewarded enough to avoid these problems. However, the king acted completely differently, which ruined all the family's plans, as they did not receive the reward they deserved. Eric knew that developing their iron mine would take years, which wouldn't even help with the food shortage. The main thing was to understand how to use what they now had to purchase all of this, because they had no choice but to provide for themselves. The problem was that his father's absence forced the vassals to look to Eric for a leader who would solve everything. The sudden responsibility, as well as the high expectations from everyone, was much more painful than Eric had previously thought. All this was so hard to feel that it began to seem like life had become like being in a coffin. And this coffin was so heavy that it was hard to even breathe. At that moment, Miesa came closer to her husband and hugged him around the neck, which brought Eric back to the world. For a moment, Ambric's face, filled with incomprehension, came to mind. But he didn't care. The man hugged his wife back, continuing to think about everything that came to mind. At that moment, he gave her a candy, which the lady was not going to refuse, after which he asked his wife not to leave him and to sit here for a while longer. Eric understood that the very fact that his wife did not run away from him and remained in her husband's arms warmed his heart. In the morning, the maids informed Madame that one of the guests who had been present earlier had dropped her handkerchief. In high society, a handkerchief was an item that a man and a woman exchanged as a sign of love. But at the moment, this was a problem. At that very moment, Madame ordered all the maids to look for the scarf along with the other things and put them away to avoid rumors. If something didn't go according to plan, it was necessary to say that the handkerchief in question belonged to the Marquise. After some time, one of the maids approached Misa's personal maid and told her everything she had learned. It was necessary to get rid of the girl so as not to create problems for others, and it was desirable to do this within 2 years. This could have been done in a couple of days, but the women needed their connections to ensure that no one found out. Since they didn't have the opportunity to come up with excuses every time to meet with the Margrave, they needed a plan. But then the personal maid said that she had the opportunity to go out into the city, and the meeting could be arranged there. After some time, the madam told her daughter-in-law that there would be a family evening that day, at which she had to behave calmly. But at that very moment, the woman told the girl to forget what she had been told. The most important thing was that she ate well, even if it looked bad. The woman carefully combed the girl's hair, all the while thinking about how thin the poor girl's neck was. After some time, the whole family was already assembled, and the count was again dissatisfied with Misa's behavior, although it had become calmer. The woman immediately told her husband to calm down, as his daughter-in-law was already trying to eat food herself. At this point, Eric asked Misu to simply tear the food apart with her hands, and then use the device. But at that moment, the man started yelling at everyone and saying that the girl was already an adult and didn't need so much care. Suddenly, his wife said that if he didn't like something, he could simply ignore Miyasu. In any case, the lady simply didn't need the man's attention, especially the kind he showed. After which, the woman told her son to make sure that his wife also eats vegetables. Suddenly, the count stood up and said that they should all make sure that the lady did not fall under any circumstances, because soon there would be a visit to the king. At that moment, Eric began to understand that there were indeed only a few days left until that moment. At this moment, the mother asked her son if he had prepared gifts for the royal palace. While he was helping Misa, the man also told his mother that all his gifts were ready. In the kingdom of Esquilier, there was a tradition for couples to visit relatives 50 days after their wedding. In the case of Eric and his wife, this was no exception. They would have to visit the king in any case. After some time, preparations for leaving for the palace began. Everyone began loading their gifts. Eric watched what was happening all this time and continued to be in his thoughts. The wife he accepted under the sympathetic glances of the others turned out to be not so bad. Here he decided to ask the girl whether she even knew her husband's name. When he asked this, there was silence, and the husband began to think that his wife might not really know who he was. However, even so, it was nice to have someone to protect and someone who gave meaning to life. After this, Eric told the lady that there was nothing wrong with it, and he was just asking. Soon the man and his wife arrived at the king's palace, where they were already accompanied by a butler. Inside the dark palace, harsh rays of sunlight were shining through the huge windows, and cold gray marble covered every centimeter of the central part of the palace. The sight was quite frightening, and considering that these were all the king's actions, the situation was even worse. 20 years ago, a young king ascended the throne and effortlessly stabilized power. The only reason this was done so easily was because his mother was incredibly strong and influential. However, 12 years ago, when many were at war, something happened in the capital that caused the king's behavior to change dramatically. The floors in the central palace were always stained with blood, which no one had time to clean up. Soon Eric and his wife stood before the king and greeted him. At that moment, the man said in a calm voice that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. He also noticed that Miesa's complexion had improved greatly since the last time he saw her. The king immediately said that he expected that he would soon be able to hear news that they would have children. Eric had absolutely no idea what to say to the king, so he decided to simply remain silent. He had to be very careful to avoid suspicion on the couple's wedding night. Eric had no intention of putting his wife through that kind of pain, and they could have simply taken the child from the cadet corps. At that moment, the king's assistant whispered something to him, after which he was told to stop chatting idle. Suddenly, the king said that when the proof of the first marriage was handed over, the princess was examined, and it was realized that she was completely unharmed. After these words, Eric began to understand that they had failed miserably, and now the whole truth could be revealed. In fact, from the wedding night onwards, the bed and the princess's body remained untouched. The king began to ask the man why he did not want an heir with royal blood, after which speculation began to circulate that Eric did not touch the princess only because he wanted to dissolve the marriage with the help of the priests. To all these assumptions, Eric said that everything was completely different from what he had imagined. He couldn't even believe that the maids could convey such details to the king. At this point, the ruler said that Chladni's heir had ridiculed the royal family by holding such a wedding. The king, looking at his sister, began to talk about how the man had received an heir, but at that moment he interrupted the thought. The idea came to mind that this happened because the family simply wanted to raise a rebellion against the authorities. Hearing these words, Eric was shocked. He understood that with these words, the king could go very far. As soon as the ruler mentioned the words about the uprising, the duke had no choice. After this, everyone's life could be in danger. Not only parents, but even servants could suffer. Eric took only 17 knights with him to the capital, who in any case would not be able to withstand the royal army. However, at that moment, the king began to call Misa to him, who reluctantly began to crawl towards him. When the girl was close enough to her brother, he began asking her to simply answer one question. He then asked the girl if her husband had undressed her on the first night she got married. Since the girl remained silent for a very long time, the king grabbed her by the hair, causing her to scream loudly. The brother began to tell her to answer, but at that moment, Eric began to worry about his wife. He began to tell the ruler to let the girl go, because she was in great pain. However, at that moment, Miesa herself spoke up and began to complain plaintively about how much pain she was in. At that moment, everyone present was shocked. No one expected that the princess could speak so easily. When Eric heard all this, he couldn't believe his ears. But the girl continued to talk about pain. And as soon as she started talking about how the process of intercourse went, the man was completely speechless. The king immediately stopped his sister, saying that he was not at all interested in her love affairs, after which he simply pushed the girl away, since she simply spoiled the king's mood with her details. At that moment, Eric ran up to Misa, who immediately began to worry about her and try to help. After some time, Eric and his wife were already returning home, where the woman fell asleep in her husband's arms. Soon the couple was met by their people, who were interested in whether the owners had been hurt. However, at this point, the Duke asked the butler to make sure that no one went to the second floor of the West Wing. It was also necessary to go to the Knights and bring Cullen, after telling him to guard the second floor. A few minutes later, Eric and his wife were already in the West Wing, where the girl began screaming that she was being attacked by ants. At that moment, Cullen himself approached the man and decided to ask the gentleman about his task again. Eric repeated to him that he should simply make sure that no one entered this place. As soon as Cullen left, Eric sat Misa on the bed and told her that now no one would hear them, even if she screamed. Now no one would be able to come to this place either, since security had been posted. He also repeated his words so that Miesa would understand everything completely. At the moment, no one would help her. After which, he began to ask the girl to say at least something, since she was able to do so. At that moment, Miesa began to smile, trying to somehow get out of this whole situation. Since the guy didn't achieve anything at first, he squeezed his wife's hand and told her that he would wait for this moment. He also started asking her how much longer she planned to pretend and keep things a secret. And at that moment, the lady began to talk about how the man should simply not pay any attention to all these antics. When she said this, Eric could not believe his ears for a moment, because even now her words were unexpected. After this, he asked his wife why she had previously acted as if she could not do anything. As soon as the lady answered, Eric began to realize that her words sounded very familiar. He also realized that his wife's voice sounded quite calm and relaxed, but her hands were noticeably shaking. After realizing this, the man got off his wife and told her that he had not meant to put pressure on her at all. So I also started thinking about how many thoughts could have been in her head, given how much she had endured. At that moment, the thought occurred to her that at the age of 8, she had been able to see her mother die. And after that, she most likely saw the king kill all her half-brothers and sisters. And in order to survive, the lady had to choose the path of simply enduring all the contempt and ridicule from others. Added to all this was the treatment that was worse than that of an animal, which was probably the most terrible thing. Thinking about how she had lived all these years, the man realized that he had absolutely no words for it. Besides, he had just met the girl, which is why he couldn't provide her with the necessary support. He understood that even a superficial phrase could console her after such an attitude towards him. The next morning, servants came to the master and mistress to check if they were awake. Eric was already dressed at this time, and his wife continued to sleep soundly after everything that had happened. The maid began to wake the lady and tell her that it was time to get up and finally eat. At this point, the man asked the maid to let his wife sleep a little longer, as she was very tired after the trip. The butler in this case offered him breakfast first. Besides, he had a lot to do that day. At this point, Eric began to think that they had all come to check the marriage confirmation, since it could have happened a little later, after the wedding night. It could also be even better if they all get the whole situation wrong. At this time, Eric began to eat, realizing that eating alone was now extremely tasteless for him. After a while, Miesa also woke up, and she also had a to-do list that revealed a way to make a mess on her desk. The next thing to do was to tear apart the clothes left by some black-haired man. It was also possible to pull out a lock of gray hair from some maid. This entire list is not even halfway through. Misa's day was quite difficult, but despite this, she managed to cope with it. All this had to be done because of the black-haired man, whom the girl did not trust at all. She felt like he would tell everyone her biggest secret, and she would have to go about her normal business. Misa also felt that Eric had been very angry with her yesterday, since she had been hiding such a thing. She thought that if her husband told anyone everything, the lady would definitely be kicked out of the palace. Thoughts began to pop into my head about whether Eric could really do this, because he had previously been very kind. At that moment, the lady ran to the mistress, who greeted her with joy. After this, Madame noticed that the girl came here alone, without any servants. But then Misa decided to lie down on her mistress's lap, who immediately realized that she was still half asleep. At that moment, Madame told the butler to simply continue his report. The information concerned the repair of a garden fence, where it was proposed to use new materials. A survey was conducted, where it was decided to use wood that would be supplied from the southern islands. Listening to the conversation between the butler and the lady, Misa wondered why it was so expensive for such a family to import materials. The butler then announced that the Rogenton family's dairy farm had recently begun producing butter and cheese. Although it was expensive, it was considered high quality, which is why he managed to get a little of it. The oil cost about 20 pasli for just one case, which was quite expensive. When Miesa heard the price, she was surprised why the oil cost so little, because for her it was like a pittance. After this, the lady suggested that the girl also try the oil, also giving her a piece. At this time, Miso was thinking about something a maid had once said about a sack of flour costing about the same. The thought came to mind that such a small piece of butter was equal to the value of that bag. She also remembered how the black-haired man was worried about the future food supply of the people. At this point, Madame noticed that Miso was eating the butter very well, after which she said that it was worth buying more. Hearing this, the lady began to calculate how much the desired amount of oil would cost them. However, it just didn't occur to me why the husband and the woman were so happy to see Misa eating. At this point, the lady began to think that there was some kind of catch to all this, because kindness cannot be just like that. In this world, no one would ever do such a thing for some plague princess who appeared out of nowhere. After some time, Eric came to his mother to pick up his wife, but this time she behaved unusually. At that moment, she was thinking that she did not want to be with this person under any circumstances. The girl immediately found herself in the arms of her husband, who told her that it would be much better if she behaved quietly. He also told her that he had not told anyone about what happened last night and had no intention of doing so. After a while, they sat down to eat, when Eric asked the girl if she could eat on her own. At this time, Misa was thinking about how ineffective the servants were in this house. Besides, they all knew that the lady preferred to eat food with her hands, but they always shoved cutlery at her that she didn't even hold in her hands. She had absolutely no strength in her hands to hold any instruments, but she tried. At this point, Eric told his wife that she was quite good at feeding herself. Suddenly, Misa dropped her fork, specifically to spite this man, because she hadn't liked him until now. The lady began to eat with her hands again, thinking that as soon as the servants arrived, they would start thinking again about what had happened here. The question in my head was what they might be thinking, and whether they could complicate the situation in any way. Eric began to become more and more embarrassed, and began asking his wife to simply stop. Based on her husband's behavior, Misa began to wonder if this man was angry with her after what happened. The husband came closer to his wife and began to remove all the food from her face, asking her whether he should feed her. Here, Misa began to think that this man was definitely not stupid, since he came to such a decision. When the man asked his wife for her hand, she was a little embarrassed, not knowing what to do, but simply gave it to him. Soon Misu was being bathed by her personal maid, but the woman asked her how she had not gotten sick after so many ice baths. The woman started talking about how she would do it and just give most people a rest. Miesa wondered why this time it was the maid who bathed her, and not her husband as usual. However, at that moment, the maid pounced on the lady, starting to pull her hair and cover her face. At that moment, Eric came into the bathroom and started asking the girls what was going on. The maid began to ask him why he had come so suddenly, after which she began to make excuses. It turned out that Miesa simply started acting up, which is why they had to use force. The man immediately told the maid that he would finish washing Misa himself, from which she was now free. The maid said that it was quite indecent on his part, but she couldn't resist. Since the girl almost drowned, the man did not need to bother himself with such a task. When the maid left, the husband began to think about how the lady should have been washed, after which he decided to finish the job with the hair. At this time, Miesa thought that her maid was constantly lying, because she was constantly treating her rudely. In the palace, they used lie and washed as if they were washing clothes, which made the treatment here much better. Eric immediately turned the water a little warmer and was about to start caring for his wife's body and hair. However, before doing this, I decided to ask Misa if she could handle this entire task on her own. The lady had a thought about why this man was suggesting that the madwoman wash herself. After some time of silence, Eric realized that she herself would not be able to wash herself any further, so he went back to the jars. At that moment, Miesa again began to think that her husband was angry with her, but she could not understand why. If she continues to get on the man's nerves, she will not get any benefit from it, which is why she should simply cooperate. When the lady began to undress and the man saw this, he began to feel more and more embarrassed. However, Misa understood that otherwise this man might simply tell everyone in the palace her secret, and when she first saw the silhouette of this man, she realized that it would be better for him to simply not resist. But now, the princess began to think that she had simply made another mistake with her assumptions. Misa thought her husband was a big evil man, but in reality, he turned out to be gentle and very kind. However, even now she began to feel that they simply didn't like her here, because the man very often walked around with a sullen expression on his face. Eric noticed many scars on his wife's back, which he decided to examine more closely. When he moved the hair away, he decided to ask her about who had inflicted such a serious injury on her earlier. At that moment, Miesa realized that there was sympathy in her husband's voice, which also sounded like pain. In response to the man's question, she decided to answer the truth and said that the king had inflicted this injury on her, after which both the girl and the man became confused, and no one could cope with it. However, Eric at that very moment suggested to his wife that they finish washing as quickly as possible in order to leave that place. Miesa was sitting in the bath again, and her husband told her to just let him know if she felt uncomfortable. After all, he was doing this for the first time, which is why he didn't really know how to wash a person without hurting him. When the girl heard this, she couldn't believe her ears, because the man could just wash her like a dog and that's it. On this day, for the first time, she felt the pleasant sensation of someone washing her. The lady began to understand that her husband was very careful with her, which was most likely why she felt so comfortable. When all the bathing procedures were completed, Eric began to dry his wife, who at that moment felt ticklish. At that moment, the lady turned around and said that she didn't care at all who would help her wash between her legs, after which she immediately understood what she had said, and she took on all the emotions that appeared on Eric's face. It was at this moment that she felt even more awkward than before. Misa looked at her husband, who had blushed even more, and then thought that she most likely was the same now. When night came, the husband and wife were already getting ready to sleep, but the lady realized that her husband was very tired, after which his wife simply lay down next to him, although she still felt quite awkward. The thought was swirling around in their heads that they were both quite tired, and that they all needed a good rest. As Misa began to try to fall asleep, memories from yesterday began to surface in her head. The man had been irritatingly unchivalrous that day, but today he was gentle and sympathetic. And when she ate carelessly, Eric could not hide his true feelings and simply showed dislike. Suddenly, the lady wondered whether her husband had already fallen asleep, so she decided to check it out. After this, the girl went into another room, forcing the man to wake up and follow her. Eric understood that it was not worth leaving the woman alone, which is why he thought it would be better to keep an eye on her. As he followed her, he began to realize that Miesa was fully reciting every dialogue she had ever heard. Eric was quite surprised by this, as he had never seen anything like this before. That's why he just stood in the doorway for a while, trying to understand what his wife was doing, after which Miesa noticed her husband's reflection in the mirror, but simply continued to finish the dialogue. At that very moment, the lady began to recount everything that had recently happened at the family dinner. The maids said in the morning that the princess was still untouched, even after everyone had been sent away. They thought that they would check the lady after this night, because intimacy between husband and wife could happen at any moment. At this time, Miesa lay and tried not to think about anything after what happened in the bathroom. However, it turned out very badly, and the wife was still very ashamed of what she said to her husband back then. Misa was well aware that she felt especially dirty that day. It also became clear that she had shown the man another strange side of herself. When the girl pretended to be crazy, she didn't think at all that other people would point fingers at her. At this time, the maids continued to talk about their mistress's love affairs. They could not understand why Eric was not aroused by Misa's naked body. However, be that as it may, it was these maids who were told not to take their eyes off the princess under any circumstances. At that moment, Miesa was listening to all these words, also playing out all the dialogues inside herself. She was well aware that she had not had any new bruises or wounds for a long time. If she were at home, some incident would have definitely happened by now, which would have made everyone frown. The lady began to think about how it would be better for her to get hurt, as she did not want to cause herself too much pain. The idea also came to mind of simply breaking something valuable, for example, in order to repeat the incident. But at that moment, she realized that it would be wrong for her to break anything in such an estate. The final decision was made, because the easiest thing for her would be to get a minor fracture. While she was walking around the palace, a maid came to her and said that she would be nearby. At that moment, the lady was thinking about what height would be best for her to get injured in order to survive. She knew that getting a fracture would be quite painful, but she had no other choice. At that moment, the maid reached out to the princess, saying that she could no longer stand aside. However, when she was captured, Misa realized that it was not a servant, but her husband. The lady began to try to break free from the black-haired man's strong grip. After some time, Eric and his wife were in the greenhouse, where all the birds had already been removed, after which he asked the lady why she was so afraid of any feathered animal. And was her fear really so severe that she could start crying? After thinking for a bit, Miesa began her story about how her fear of birds began to develop. And at this point, Eric had to ask more and more accompanying questions to understand the fear better. However, there was a question in my head about why this man was so clingy. When she was silent for a while, the husband warned his wife that no one would see or hear them here. Eric then asked his wife if it was because she simply had difficulty talking. Misa thought that in her head, she was simply talking to herself perfectly. However, when she tried to speak in real life, she did it rather poorly. When Eric began to say that he understood perfectly well how it was for the lady to speak after so much time, she was a little surprised. She had absolutely no idea how to explain her condition, but she understood that the man's attitude towards her was truthful. The husband realized that when the girl repeated the dialogues, she was practicing her speech and trying to improve it. He also asked the lady not to nod at questions that should have been answered, which would also improve her speech. And when Misa saw her husband's serious expression, she could not ignore his words, after which the wife began to try to answer the man's request, although it turned out to be quite difficult. As soon as she heard her voice, she realized that there was something strange about it, which made her immediately close her mouth. This made Misa very embarrassed, and Eric began to try to calm the girl down, saying that it was normal. After which, the man asked his wife if she would like to watch how the man did it. He showed his wife where the human larynx was, also letting her feel it while talking. At that moment, Eric began to demonstrate the work of his larynx again, and the lady looked at and observed everything. The man also began to explain the approximate functioning of this part of the body, as well as how its position changed depending on the sounds. Eric had previously been taught some tricks to restore his voice as quickly as possible when it broke. Also, if Misa wanted to say something, she could not be shy about it and just practice. The wife decided to ask her husband about what the voice breaking was and how it worked in general. At this point, Eric started laughing, trying to get back into a serious state. When he calmed down, he told me that every person's voice changed at a certain age, which was called breaking. If Misa had any more questions, she could have simply asked them further. The lady decided to inquire what the maid's phrase meant when they said that the princess had still not been touched. But because the man did not understand what his wife was saying, Misa thought about what was said. In order for him to understand, she decided to show what was being discussed. And at that moment, Eric became very embarrassed and asked the lady not to do that again. However, Miesa decided to stand her ground and asked him if they would be doing this anytime soon. After all, if they had not confirmed their marriage, then most likely the girl would have simply been returned back to the king. Eric didn't know what to answer to the princess's question, because he was still completely unprepared for this. That's why he suggested to Miesa that they first get to know each other better, and only then think about intimacy. Hearing this, the lady could not understand how one could be unprepared for something, but the man suggested that his wife simply take a walk around the greenhouse and chat with each other. When he did this, his wife wondered if this was the right time for this. But still, she couldn't refuse him, so she agreed to go for a walk. She understood that the maid was talking about watching the princess, which would prevent the princess from being carried to the king that night. While Eric and Miesa were walking, he decided to ask her if it was true that she felt uncomfortable walking. When the princess looked at her husband with a sly smile, he immediately realized that this too was an act and not real. The lady was thinking at that moment that she had managed to perfect this gait with great difficulty, but now it was perfect. But when her husband asked Misa how she did it, she had absolutely no idea how to explain it. She simply tensed the muscles in the back of her thighs and calves, which is what created such grace in her already perfect gait. After which, Misa extended her hands towards the guy, showing her desire to be right in his strong arms. At that moment, he took his wife in his arms and was about to carry her further, since she had walked much further than usual. The princess began to think that this man was much better than she had previously thought. Misa also remembered being told how a couple's first wedding night was supposed to go. As a formality, the priestess read it in her monotonous voice, which lost interest. Because it mentioned severe pain below, the princess found the matter very unpleasant and terrible. However, now for her, it was one of the most important things to strengthen the marriage. And ideally, Miesa would like to do this as soon as possible, so as not to be afraid of something like this later. But after talking with Eric, he began to constantly look for excuses on this matter and try to put everything off until later. He did this even though his life was currently in the hands of the king. The lady had the feeling that this thought was of concern only to her, and the man did not need it. At that moment, the thought came to mind that the husband had put off this matter until the last minute because he wanted to dissolve the marriage. Misa began to realize that if all the kindness he showed was a lie, then he definitely wanted to get rid of it. The girl began to think about what else could have happened in this case, which immediately began to change her mood. The princess realized that every time she was treated very well in this place, bad thoughts constantly came into her head. That is why the lady wanted to confirm her marriage with Eric as soon as possible, in order to immediately strengthen their union. After all, the princess really liked living here. When she was here, she was able to feel the times from her childhood. Because the lady did not answer her husband for a long time, he approached her and began to try to bring her back to reality. As soon as he managed to do this, the man began asking his wife if she was feeling unwell. At this moment, the princess began to repeat the words spoken by the maids earlier, which surprised Eric again, after which she remained silent for a while to think about everything that had been said. And at that moment, her husband began to ask her who dared to say such a thing to her earlier. But from the intonation and the state of the princess, Eric understood that all this was on the part of Madame Malika. It was at this moment that the man realized what the lady had meant and what she had said earlier. The husband again started talking about how they weren't really acquainted, which is why he didn't want to do something like that. At that very moment, the princess uttered Eric's words, which he had spoken in the greenhouse. When she began to do this, the heir listened to her attentively and wondered why she was saying this, after which he realized that she had previously listened to him attentively in order to soon say the same thing. Since the girl had listened to most of her husband's story and began to want to confirm their marriage, this was extremely surprising. But that was precisely why he didn't want to do anything like that, since he didn't know anything about her, unlike the princess. That's why Eric also needed to prepare so that everything would go more or less well. Since this whole thing couldn't be completed with the snap of a finger, it was necessary to come up with a plan of action. When he suggested that they discuss the plan fully at night, the princess was unhappy about it, but she could do nothing about it. She also found it strange, as she had heard that even those who were doing it for the first time were quite good. That evening, when the couple went to bed, the man told Misa that he had quite a lot of difficult questions, but in any case, he was powerless to change the lady's desire to confirm their marriage. He suggested that his wife share some information about themselves with each other every night, so that they both could get what they wanted. That's why he was willing to start a conversation about something simple, so that she could answer calmly. After which came the first question, where Eric asked her what her favorite food was. As soon as the princess said that it was meat, he was a little surprised, because he had previously thought differently. It seemed to him that the princess's favorite food was various sweets and cakes. Eric's favorite food was various fruits and vegetables, which were often included in the army's dry rations. Suddenly, the man asked his wife if she felt stuffy sitting at home all the time. Misa couldn't understand what he meant and how it could be stuffy at home. But then the girl decided to repeat his mother's phrase, where she asked him to calm down and stop doing what he was doing. At that moment, Eric began to laugh, which made the princess confused about the situation. When the heir calmed down, he told his wife that he really liked it when she called him by name. At the man's request, the princess called his name again, causing him to tell the lady that she had a very pleasant voice. Moreover, she submitted to her husband very simply, for which he was ready to thank her. In gratitude, he was going to make a small gesture of goodwill and do something she would like, after which he kissed his wife on the forehead, which made her a little embarrassed and also surprised by the unexpectedness. Misa began to strongly understand that for the first time in her life, she began to feel such an interest in someone. The princess possessed enormous tenacity, which helped her deceive many people from childhood. It was quite surprising, but also absurd, that she had so carefully disguised and hidden herself. Eric could not understand what thoughts could possibly be in that small and seemingly cute head. He was also interested in how sincere the lady was to him, which made him want to get to know her even more. The next morning began quite hectic, so much so that the heir had to be called from his work. A huge number of people gathered in one of the rooms who did not understand at all how this could have happened. Mother scolded the maids for not keeping an eye on things and not fulfilling their only task in this place. At that moment, behind the maids, the man saw his wife, who was lying down and also looked very bad. It turned out that in the morning, the maids again checked the princess to see if she had had anything with the man, but they realized that she had not. At that moment, one of them began to think of one of the options, and also began to speak her guess, trying to put the whole puzzle together in her head. The maid wondered if her theory was true, after which she told her friend to just not take it into her head, because they needed to deal with the princess. The woman asked her if she had an appointment for today, after which she learned that the appointment was only for tomorrow. The maids began to get Misa up, so that she could finally get dressed, since it was already late. The princess had been enduring this kind of treatment for 10 years now. However, her ever-worsening obsessive-compulsive disorder continued to raise alarm bells. At this moment, the maid was thinking about why the 3 pillars of the kingdom were in such a state. The second woman didn't know this either, but she was more interested in when they would all return to their homes. Misa looked at them with a mentally unhealthy gaze, and quietly, but frighteningly, giggled. At this time, the other maids were discussing whether the princess would like their gift, which they had worked hard on. The girl told her friend that something rather strange had happened recently, which surprised the other one. While they were talking about this, Miesa appeared behind them, running away from her personal maids. As soon as it passed, the maids were so surprised by what had happened that they were speechless. But at that very second, they realized that they had to run after the princess to find out what had happened to her. When a few more maids joined them, the princess began to doubt her plan. Since the staircase was completely occupied by maids, Misha had to change her route, which forced her to run to the balcony. As soon as she ran up to him, she noticed that there were many flowers below, which would make the landing softer. It didn't take long to figure out why the princess simply jumped out of the window, hoping for a safe landing. That's why Madame was now scolding everyone who was present at all, since it wasn't that hard to keep an eye on Miesa. The maids lazed around all day, but continued to insist on being with her personally. At that moment, Eric approached his wife and began examining her, trying to better understand what had happened. He understood that at the moment, the atmosphere in this place was very tense and serious. Suddenly, he turned to one of his assistants and told her to prepare for the test. Gela, a member of the Chladni family's night order, told her commander that she would do everything in the best possible way. It would also be quite reasonable to assign one of the family's maids to look after Miesa. The man asked Adele to accompany Madame Malika to the palace so that she could arrive safely. Everyone else was free at the moment and could go about their business. Mother said that she never expected that following all the plans would be so difficult. Besides, these 2 maids had to have all their limbs torn off for them to understand everything. Eric, however, began to understand that his mother most likely saw her own daughter in her son's wife. The spring before Rosie's birthday was critical for her, as it was the day she was alone in the forest. A drunken night knocked her down that day, causing the girl to simply leave the world, which was not her fault. The woman then lost her mind, because the grief from the death of her child overwhelmed her. The knight responsible for the incident was a groom who gave everything he could. Mother gave them all the same sentence. They all had to lose their heads. Eric's father criticized his wife's harsh punishment and simply wanted to cancel it. Since then, the man and woman began to drift further and further apart, and today everything could happen again. Eric understood that it was better for the woman if she did not interfere in all these matters. That's why he told her that he would deal with everything himself, which shocked her. After all, given the woman's anger, she could turn all this against someone else. Gela examined the princess and reported that the princess should not have any serious problems with mobility. When Madame heard these words, she was immensely happy, because the understanding that if she was in a normal state, it greatly eased the situation. After which she told her son that he was indeed right, and she should cool her head. She looked at Miyasu, telling Eric to take good care of his wife. When the woman left, Gela followed her, but Eric stopped her and told her to wait a while. He wanted to know from her if that was really all, after which she said that there really weren't many new injuries. She also managed to see the princess's old scars, but she was not going to tell anyone else about them. Eric also reported that the girl had been working quite a lot lately, which she began to deny. However, from tomorrow onwards, she would have to account for everything she had managed to see, even if she didn't want to. The man looked at her with a stern gaze that she would never be able to resist. When Eric was alone with his wife, he told her that it was wonderful to see that she had not slept, because of which I started asking her why she did all this and what the reason was. A tension ran through the princess's body, making her reluctant to say anything. Once Eric realized this, he told Misa that she could trust him with this information, even if it was something serious. After which he again asked her why she had caused all this fuss since early morning. The princess, after thinking for a moment, told the man that she had her own reason for this matter. When she told Eric that she couldn't explain it in any way, because she couldn't even find the words for it. At that moment, the heir asked the princess to never hurt herself again in her life. Instead, she could easily break or tear something, because it would not affect her health in any way. Eric also didn't mean that she should do nothing at all. She could do anything, but not hurt herself. After that, he asked her to promise that she would never hurt herself again. When the princess agreed with her husband, he told her to rest, and if she needed anything, just call him. At that moment, she had a question about what had just happened. She did not understand whether she had a new maid. The heir could not believe that, of all the things she could have asked, she had asked exactly this. This girl was a student of a famous doctor, which is why she had a good command of herbs and could easily cure someone. Moreover, despite her pretty appearance, she had good strength and could easily defend herself from wolves. She was also quite cautious, which was also a good thing for being a princess's maid. Gela was also not someone who could be easily bribed, which is why it was better for her not to talk about Misa's secret at the moment. That was why it was advisable for her to continue pretending for a while, until they got the others ready. Suddenly, the heir asked Misa if she remembered Cullen, who was standing at the door that day. From now on, Eric thought to assign him to guard the west wing on the second floor, and further. After the boy lost 2 fingers during torture, he began using his left hand to wield a sword. This man was one of the most reliable people the man had ever known. However, he didn't tell him anything about the princess, so she didn't have to worry about anything. In any case, since the lady was injured, the man needed to take a break from work for a while. But Eric would have to leave in the morning to take care of most of the urgent matters, after which he would return immediately. He also understood that he was the only person the princess trusted so much and showed true emotions to. At that very moment, the lady sat down next to her husband and began asking him if there would be many stories after this. She began to talk about the need to get closer and prepare mentally, since the man had previously asked for this. When Eric realized what his wife was getting at, he started yelling at her not to even think about such a thing at that moment. Since she was wounded, what the princess wanted was out of the question, because it would only make her feel worse. At that moment, the man was thinking that even in a state of anger, he could not tear his eyes away from his wife. He also understood perfectly well that he and the princess were very different. Their ways of life were completely different. However, Eric decided to ask Misa why she was in such a hurry to confirm their marriage. In response to this question, the lady told him a phrase that she had previously heard from other people's lips, and it was this phrase that had been haunting her. She also said the rest of the phrases from the dialogue, which said that they might soon get rid of her. When Eric listened to all this, he could not believe his ears, so he sat and did not even know what to say. However, he understood perfectly well that all this time Misa had been so worried because of Amberic's words. He immediately told his wife that he had absolutely no intention of divorcing her. They still had a very long married life ahead of them, so she didn't have to worry about anything. That is why there was no need to rush things at this point. If the princess was still interested or worried about something, she could calmly tell him about it at that moment. Eric also asked his wife if she had any doubts about his honesty. However, if this were so, then she would have seen all of her husband's papers perfectly well and would have been nearby whenever possible. Since all the princess's thoughts were now calm, she could lie down and rest peacefully. If she felt uneasy sleeping alone, Eric could call the maids into the room, since she had previously enjoyed being among them. It turned out that she spent time there only because the workshop was quiet and calm. Unlike other places, while she was there, she could also listen to others' conversations and absorb information. When Eric learned of this, he could not understand why the princess needed the maid's information. He also decided to ask her if she had done the same in the palace, after which he received a positive answer. The princess also told her husband about the conversations she had heard earlier regarding bribes and certain opinions. Thanks to her pretenses, the lady now knew most of the court secrets that no one else knew. The princess also revealed that Adele did not like the white-haired butler and did not trust him. The head maid preferred portly men, and many in the estate thought so. At that moment, Eric realized that their butler actually liked the head maid. However, if she were single, she would want to marry him anyway. The man began to be amazed by his girlfriend's amazing memory, because even now it all made sense. At that moment, the heir lay down on the princess's bed and told her that he wanted to talk to her more closely. She began to think that her wish could happen today, and everything would go perfectly. However, he asked Misa if she knew why Malika bribed Namira. Was it because the woman wanted to cause trouble? or was she trying to accompany Miesu? The princess, hearing this question, thought about what could possibly be answered to this question. Eric told the lady that she needed to respond if they wanted to get closer to each other. Misa told her husband that Malaika and the swindler were supposed to meet tomorrow. It could also be called the meeting of the three pillars representing the kingdom of Esquilier. Among the three was Salichez, who was the family of the king's mother, but it was destroyed a few years ago. At that moment, Eric remembered how the girl stopped him, and he noticed that there was some kind of silhouette behind the tree. Most likely, the pillar that Madame Malika met with was Crispin, and perhaps they had a plan. It was necessary to attract people's attention in order to understand what was happening. At that moment, her husband kissed the princess on the cheek, which immediately brought her back from her thoughts. He told the girl that this was his gratitude for all her answers to his questions. The next day, many people were talking about how the new maid could have harmed the princess, which she completely denied. The previous maid claimed that there might have been some kind of poison in the ointment she offered. At this point, she tasted the ointment and then said that this ointment was completely safe. Since the head maid was so concerned about the safety of this ointment, she might as well try applying it to herself. Eric went to his wife and told her that he would try to return before lunch to spend it with him. When he talked to her, everyone else was very surprised, because they did not understand what was happening now. Eric was about to leave, but decided to tell the others to take care of his wife. But he couldn't understand what the princess did yesterday, because it was rather unreasonable. Of course, this gave him the opportunity to put pressure on the palace maids, which led to the idea that everything had been planned from the very beginning. Eric knew that he would have to try hard to understand his wife's true motives. First, he will have to get rid of prying eyes and extra ears to avoid problems. And after that, it was possible to begin to act step by step and get to know the princess better. At this time, one guy was informed of his new temporary position, which left him in shock. This only needed to be done for a short time, after which he could return to his duties. The guy told his captain that he didn't have enough time to keep track of everything and that he had his own things to do. However, Eric understood perfectly well that Amberic had no business as such, which is why it was chosen to entrust the matter to him. After some time, another man came to Eric and reported on the work done. At that moment, Eric praised his assistant, which was quite unusual for the man. At that moment, Adele came to the master, also reporting that the servant had sent her there. The man knew very well that this woman was an experienced senior maid who had been cared for since childhood. After yesterday's visit to the palace with Malika, she had thoughtfully brought a transcript of the report from Palsgrave. The man told the woman that if they were all replaced by some passerby, then everything would be in vain. That's why Eric needed the help of the head maid, because she did an excellent job. Adele was more suitable for the selection of palace maids than the heir himself, who spent most of his life on the battlefield. She remained in the capital, interacting with other families, collecting information about each one, and also resolving issues. However, the woman thought that it would be much better if the mistress took care of these matters. Although he had received his mother's permission to take Adele, he wanted her not to learn any new information. The man had heard that Malaika had given bribes to the maid Namira, without warning anyone. Therefore, the heir first wanted to sort this out, and then take care of the rest of the affairs. However, it would be difficult to contact the head maid directly, but it was possible to reach her through her right hand. When Eric heard this, he immediately thought about this decision and whether it was worth doing. As soon as the heir returned to his home, he immediately visited Miesa, who was sitting and drawing. It turned out that the new maid decided to help the princess recover faster, because creativity helped with this. Since the man had never heard of it, the maid said that this information was not written on the internet. The girl had also heard that the young lady had already gone through a lot in her life. That's why she thought that it would be good for a person who constantly holds back emotions to let them out. Eric said that the maid should simply read books to the princess, because she liked it. When the lady heard this idea, she realized that it would be just a great option for the mistress, since she would sleep better. The idea came to mind to read the girl various fairy tales at night, and instill in her interest in this in every possible way. At that moment, the heir asked Gela to return to her main job, which surprised her. However, at that moment, it seemed to the Duke that she wanted to tell him something, which is why the assistant simply left. When she was outside the door, she became furious, because it was completely unthinkable that someone would work on two fronts. The assistant also listened to all this, and told the doctor that she would have been paid for both jobs at once, which is why it was not a problem. Having learned this information, the girl immediately changed her mind. because in this case, two positions at once were not so bad. At that moment, Eric appeared from behind, asking the maid where the princess's clothes were. When the man received the answer, he immediately left, which puzzled Gela, because he immediately got down to business. However, if you think about it, any commander always moved on to the task he received immediately, without putting it off until later. Despite his behavior, Eric was always polite to the young lady, and not only, which was very good. However, it was rather strange that he treated his wife this way, with whom he could barely communicate. Gela said that it was wonderful if the Duke got along so well with the princess, and most likely, her words simply went beyond all bounds. However, the guard never personally saw how the commander communicated with his wife, and therefore could not judge. His tone of communication with everyone was rather cold, but he never treated people rudely. This man was one of those who valued the trust of others in him the most. At this time, Eric was drawing a bath for his wife, while asking her if she really liked drawing. However, at that moment, the princess started talking about how she didn't like children's books, as she had already outgrown those interests. To this, Eric informed his wife that it would really be better for him to read books that would help with speech. The princess repeated the phrase of the man, who said that she had no elementary manners, which is why there was nothing to talk about with her. The husband understood that the princess wanted to read about manners and improve her level, which is why he needed to bring books about this, after which the man told his wife that the bath was already ready and the lady could already climb into it. However, the princess immediately turned away from her husband and told him that his face had begun to embarrass him. The Duke was surprised by what he heard, because he did not understand why the girl spoke like that. But Misa continued to talk about embarrassment. Misa immediately told the man to leave the bathroom, as she planned to wash herself without bothering him. At this point, the husband offered to help the girl wash his hair, and he could leave the rest to her. When the princess was sitting in the water, Eric asked her to answer in simple and understandable words, so that it would be easier for the princess to practice. As soon as she heard this, she thought about these words, because they sounded very reasonable and simple. The lady told her husband to leave the bathroom, as they were already finished with the hair. The heir did not want to stand his ground in this case, since the lady had her own desires, but she could always call on him for help. Soon the princess came out to him all dissatisfied and wet. She really didn't want to contact anyone after that. She also told her husband that the next day Gela would simply wash her, as it would be much easier. At that moment, Eric noticed that the princess had put her nightgown on backwards. He also called her to him, as she was very wet and needed to be dried again. Before going to bed, the heir asked his wife how she spent her morning, in addition to what he saw. While he was bandaging the princess's hand, the man noticed that the tips of her fingers were wrinkled from the water. He also informed his wife that the kitchen had been informed that the lady really liked meat. However, the man could not understand why the girl was so thin if she had previously eaten well. To this question, she said words that were heard in the palace, where the conversation was about how it was better to give her greens, since the rest would simply be smeared. Previously, the princess also had 5 maids, but all of them were as disrespectful to her as the remaining 2. However, at this point, the lady began to say that if these maids were to suffer, then Vermel would find out about everything. At this point, the heir told the princess that over the past few days, she had become much more fluent in her speech. Miesa began to say that she had always spoken well before, but she just hadn't had the opportunity to practice. She wanted to practice at night, but as soon as she was about to leave, Eric would not let her go, even if he was sleeping. When the man found out about this, he immediately felt awkward, since he had previously thought that it would be better if he didn't let her go anywhere. That is why he told the princess that she could now practice freely in front of him. He also decided to ask his wife whether she was an informant, since she was constantly worried about the value of words. When the girl told him her secret, she started asking him constantly about basic things she didn't know. Sometimes she asked questions that were quite difficult to answer. Every day the lady spoke, it became easier and more interesting to talk to her. Also, all her speech became more literate and understandable, also becoming similar to the speech of an ordinary person. Since the princess already knew most of the words, the lady kept repeating them in her head. Since she answered all her husband's questions, she asked him to kiss her as a reward. At that moment, Eric told her that they were husband and wife, and they needed to talk to each other anyway. Misa did not understand this, but she knew very well that she was of a much higher rank than her husband. However, Eric told the princess that she was no longer of royal blood, but an ordinary aristocrat, He also explained that in their situation, the marriage could be called morganatic, since they were not equal before. After these words, the heir noticed that Miesa was again listening attentively and looking at him, absorbing the information. At that moment, the man asked her if she was disappointed in this marriage, to which he received a negative answer. The lady said that she felt very comfortable here, and that being an aristocrat was much better. Suddenly, the princess began to talk about something that Eric could not understand, which is why he asked her again. She immediately said that she had saved a man from accusations of treason. Eric immediately began to think that if he had not faced problems and danger, he would never have been able to marry her. Suddenly, he began to look at his wife's jubilant face, as well as her flushed cheeks. After that, he told her that he would be grateful to her for most of his life and time. The princess told the man that she was glad to be married to him. The heir understood that he could not take his eyes off his wife's beautiful face. At that moment, Eric came as close to her as possible and looked into her beautiful eyes. He asked the girl to close her eyes and just relax to make it more comfortable, after which the man kissed his wife, which caused both of them to blush slightly and feel embarrassed. Miesa was thinking about how strange this kiss was, because there was nothing in her mouth that could be taken out. When the guy fell behind the princess, she began to become very embarrassed, and Eric began to smile even more. She also could not understand why her husband did not find his behavior strange. As soon as he continued kissing the princess, she began to stop him and tell him that it was wrong. The lady also started asking him if he knew exactly what he was doing, because she thought it was not normal. In her opinion, the man was doing everything completely wrong, because he had never done anything like this before. She also told Eric that the upper body should not be touched at all, as it was said in church. The heir told the princess that what he did was so that the girl would not be hurt in the future. He also said that if Misa continues to stand his ground, things will not go any further. The husband knew only one way to prepare his wife, which is why he asked her to simply not be stubborn and trust. She should have done so for her own desire to confirm the marriage, as well as for the man's sake. He was touched by her devotion, so he was going to stay with her longer, because he did not want to harm her. Miesa, however, believed that this was not the case at all, and that Eric was doing completely senseless things. At that moment, the man told the princess that it would be much better if she just kept quiet and trusted her husband. In the morning, the maids could not understand whether the husband and wife had done their job, because everything happened so suddenly. The maids also believed that the man simply had a mistress, which was why his mood had changed so much. Miesa thought that her husband knew absolutely nothing about the marriage confirmation process, since he did such a thing at night. She also understood that if things continued like this, the couple would soon have big problems. At that moment, Gela entered the room and announced that the girl had spare clothes for that day. The maid was worried that the clothes the lady wore yesterday were not dry yet, but at that moment, she noticed the red spots on the princess's neck, also beginning to think that it was a rash. At this time, Eric was with Adele and discussed with her their plan of action regarding replacing Madame Malika. The woman told the gentleman that she had already stopped further investigation to avoid suspicion. The heir thought that the maid did not have any special abilities or skills. From what Adele just told me, Madame Maliki had a lot of terrible habits. She even tried to steal valuables from the palace, after which she simply bribed the headmaid not to tell anyone about it. She apparently had a great knack for bribing and provoking the headmaid by showering her with gifts, and the headmaid's penchant for luxury was very strong, which is why it was easy to get what you wanted from her. At that moment, Adele handed over the file to the maid, which also contained a list of the jewelry with which the head had been bribed. Gela and Miesa went for a walk, where the woman was outraged by what the Duke had done. She couldn't believe that Eric could treat someone who acted like a little child that way. At that moment, the maid told the mistress to scratch and bite if she didn't like the master. However, at this moment, Misa began to feel very uncomfortable, because the woman also did not accept her. Gela continued to talk about what had happened. Since the man and Miesa were a couple, no one would be against them. She also decided to tell the lady that she had previously considered her brother the most pathetic, but now she was not so sure about it. The maid's family also had a girl who looked like Miyasu. Her name was Tuli. In fact, the woman had a lot of brothers and sisters. In total, they gave birth to 8 children. But one day, a severe outbreak of plague swept through their home village, and Tuli's sister barely survived. Although she survived, the fever did not go away without consequences, which made the girl look like a princess. Since the family was poor, the father could not provide for a disabled child. The decision was made to take Tuli to a place from which she would not be able to return on her own. Misia felt very sad about this story, but she couldn't say anything, even though she really wanted to. The princess understood that it was perfectly normal for family members to kill each other, but she managed to learn something new. Usually, Gela told the horses in the stables, or the dogs running past about all her worries, but today she told everything to the lady. Misa, at that moment, was mostly thinking about her own things, barely listening to the maid at certain moments. Since she had previously been called a rat and a toad, the comparisons of the maid to a horse and a dog were more pleasant. Gela continued to tell the girl about her life before, because she could not tell this to anyone. As soon as the maid started talking about confidence, the princess immediately began to wonder about it. At that moment, Eric appeared behind the girls, having been looking for his wife for some time. Gela had worked very well that day, which is why she was already free, since the lady was already under supervision. The woman said goodbye to her master, saying that she had nothing more to say to the man. When the maid left, the heir approached the princess and asked her how she had spent her time and whether she had enjoyed herself. At that moment, Misa told her husband that he no longer needed to come for her. Eric began to think that the princess was uncomfortable about this, but that was not the point. She asked him about it only because she didn't want to take up the busy man's time. The lady understood that when the boy and the girl were next to each other, none of the people said anything. However, when they were apart, one could also hear statements like someone simply did not want to take up the gentleman's time. And when the girl was with Gela, everyone around could talk to each other calmly, without embarrassment. At this point, Misa noticed that her husband's mood had changed dramatically for the worse. The man suggested that his wife wear clothes that suited her, since this one did not emphasize her status. Even taking into account frequent changes of clothes, the princess should have been dressed at least a little more expensively. These clothes were too much for her, because the clothes were too simple and terrible. Eric would like his wife to wear clothes that, although simple, would be much more beautiful and at least look more expensive. But there was also a reason for simple things, because everyone was counting on the Chladni family to understand from the very beginning that the lady was simply insignificant. It seemed to the girl that here too, they would soon show her their true and bad face. Everyone continued to address her as a princess, maintaining the disgust, but Misa did not want to tell her husband about it. She also told Eric that she planned to dig up the tree roots tomorrow, which was quite a messy job. It was because of this that the girl did not want to wear beautiful clothes at all, because it would ruin them. She also realized that her husband was constantly holding back, which made her want to avoid conversations that might provoke him. When the heir heard this, he suggested that Miesa simply change the fabric to a softer one and take at least a spoon with her. As soon as the lady heard this, she was surprised by it, because previously no one respected her sequence of actions and constantly interfered. Eric was completely different. He was constantly worried about her and her condition in general. He also always paid attention to any changes in the girl, which also surprised her very much. Previously, the Duke was worried that his wife would always be pale and too thin, but now everything has changed. Miasa hoped that this man would not take away her peaceful and calm life again, returning it back. At that moment, a man appeared behind the couple, heading in their direction. When Misa realized this, she immediately began digging in the ground with a stick so that no one could suspect anything. It turned out that this man was simply making sure that the trees in the garden were not too tall. Eric told him that for his age, the man worked very hard, as it was before. While the princess looked at them, she thought about why Eric treated her like this, when he could have behaved like everyone else. When the man left them, the girl told her husband that it was this man who had been looking at her sideways while she was digging in the ground. It seemed to her that he hated her for what she was doing here, because he would have to fix it later. At this moment, the husband drew his wife's attention to himself in order to say one rather important thing. Even if she thought the man hated her, she was wrong, because any gardener would not like it if someone dug up the roots. After which, the princess realized that she had often behaved like a child. But even in this case, Eric was calm. The man continued talking about the gardener, while Misa was listening to him attentively. All the words of this man did not affect the princess at all. On the contrary, she began to consider her husband a king, and not an ordinary one, but one that came straight from the pages of fairy tales, because he was exactly the same as they wrote in them. At that moment, Eric suggested that the lady go into the house, since it was quite hot outside at that moment. When night fell, the husband asked the princess what else she liked about his behavior. At that moment, She was thinking that Eric continued to do all these senseless things that night. However, even so, he continued to do everything in moderation and not overdo it. Also listening to the girl's wishes, Miesa immediately told him that she liked it when he carried her in his arms and hugged her in every possible way. However, she still couldn't understand why he was doing all this if they just needed to be saved. At that moment, the princess realized that she was starting to catch her breath, but the reason was unknown to her. Since the girl did not answer one of Eric's questions, he told her that he would not continue doing what he was doing. Misia thought this was extremely dirty and ungrateful on the part of her husband, but there was nothing she could do. She began to tell him why she liked being in his arms so much, also giving reasons, after which she again plunged into thoughts about why they chose such a difficult path, because there was an easier path. She didn't understand whether everything they were doing now mattered if there was a chance that they both would die. At this point, Misa asked her husband whether they could be considered lovers. Eric told the princess that they could not be called that, since they were spouses without romantic feelings. At this point, the girl asked whether it was possible to love someone else in this case or not. The Duke told Miesa that there were cases when a married man had intimate relations with another. However, despite this, the man was not one of those and continued to remain faithful to his wife. He also hoped that his wife would not have any parallel relationships with another. After all, he could not understand why it was so difficult for people to remain faithful to their spouses. At that moment, he asked his wife whether she had taught Gela, with whom she spent time, the official dialect. When she said she tried, Eric kissed her again and said it was pretty sweet. Memories of how sexual intercourse should have gone according to the priestesses, where one simply had to endure, came into one's head. However, now she felt very good from all these useless actions in her opinion, which also made her very embarrassed. The events moved to the morning of the next day, where the maids were already waiting for the princess. The princess was dressed in a more beautiful dress and had to stand still so that a bib could be put on her, which, by the way, looked quite beautiful and suited her dress very well. All the maids seemed to be absolutely delighted with the princess's appearance, especially with the bib they had made for her. The princess immediately began to bite this beautiful bib, and the girl standing above her decided to ask Gela if she also thought that the princess looked simply delightful, just like a real fairy. Seeing how the princess began to tear everything off herself, Gela immediately began to furiously scream with requests not to do this. And whether the princess listened to her, we will find out with the release of new chapters. See you soon, my beloved viewers.